May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. You may be seated. I was 15 weeks pregnant the first time I was able to visit my husband's home country of Pakistan. We had been married a few months earlier. I had just completed my last semester of seminary, and we had a 2-week gap between my final exam and Yale University's commencement exercises. Soon we'd be moving back to the Bay Area. Soon I'd be ordained and starting a new job. Soon we'd be parents. So we took advantage of that gap and flew around the world. Despite my lower than usual energy levels, we had a wonderful visit. After years of FaceTiming with his siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews, and friends, it was a joy to finally be together. As we boarded the short flight from Lahore to Abu Dhabi, from which we'd go on to New York, I worried I might need a vacation to recover from this vacation. Hamid and I took our seats, eager to get home. We'd been told the flight was full, but the plane was relatively empty. So we waited and waited. Just a few minutes before we were to depart, we heard some commotion at the door. And then a parade of people, all dressed in flowing white clothing, began to pour onto the plane. They carried no purses or luggage, but each held enormous rectangular bags, still bearing the logos of the rice they had originally held. Instead of shoes, they wore threadbare slippers, some hastily made of duct tape, beneath feet that appeared unacquainted with things like arch support and waterproofing. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it seemed that they weren't sure what to do now that they finally found themselves on this plane. And with equal measures of courtesy and condescension, the stewardess helped them find their seats, showed them their seatbelts, insisted that they really did have to put them on, and then helped them stow their recycled rice bags in the compartment overhead. Haman leaned into me, seeming both amused and touched, and whispered, "They're Haji," using the Arabic word for Muslims making the pilgrimage to Mecca, this being one of 5 spiritual practices known as the pillars of Islam. Every Muslim is supposed to make this journey at least once in their lives. They're villagers, Hamid explained amidst the din of voices. They've never been on a plane before. They've never left their village. They've likely saved for this their entire lives, Claire. I had this strange sense of momentarily being close to a story so much bigger than my own. I too had been a pilgrim before. I'd walked the Camino across Spain when I was 18, had led a pilgrimage to Jerusalem when I was 20. I had studied Islam and Arabic for years and had read accounts of the Hajj. Central to that pilgrimage are ritual enactments of our common humanity. Haji remove their usual clothing and jewelry and Apple Watches if they're lucky enough to have one. They all wear white. They cut or cover their hair. They leave their baggage and their things and their ordinary lives behind. As this beautifully diverse group circles the Kaaba, they're reminded that each and every person on this planet is precious in God's sight. It was deeply moving to witness these villagers' faith in action, to glimpse the beginning of what would surely be a life-changing journey. This group of Haji came to mind as I read today's gospel. The story we just heard is often called the cleansing of the temple. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this event takes place as Jesus nears the end of his earthly pilgrimage. He and his disciples have been slowly making their way from Galilee to Jerusalem, and they come to the city on the cusp of Passover, a holiday during which Jews from all over the known world made pilgrimage to the holy city. Jesus and his disciples were not unique in converging on Jerusalem at just that time, no more so than the 2 or 3 million Muslims around the world who make the Hajj every year. In ancient times, Jerusalem was always full of pilgrims, but during Passover, the city was full to bursting with them. In all four of the Gospels, Passover, and thus pilgrimage, are the backdrop for Holy Week. For Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though, Jesus' outburst in the temple is the act of civil disobedience that seals his fate and marks him for death. From that moment on, Rome is out for him. From that moment on, his path leads straight to the cross. But in John's Gospel, which we heard today, the story of the cleansing of the temple takes place at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Just a few verses before this, he is turning water into wine at a wedding feast in Cana, his very first miracle. For Christians walking to Santiago de Compostela, the climax or culmination of the experience is going to a mass in the cathedral. For Muslims going to Mecca, it's walking around the Kaaba. For Jews going to Jerusalem in ancient times, the destination was the temple, and everything led up to an appointed priestly sacrifice that could only happen there. So Jesus enters the temple, full of pious, heartfelt Jews from every corner of creation, and he finds merchants hawking their wares, charging exorbitant rates for the sacrificial animals, cattle, sheep, doves. Most Jews journeyed so far that they couldn't afford to bring the animal that they needed to sacrifice with them all the way to Jerusalem. So there was a legitimate need for someone to proffer these creatures. But the merchants saw in this vulnerable group a real cash cow. They're not going to come all the way to Jerusalem, embark on this enormous trip, and not make a sacrifice. How much do they value that sheep? How much can we squeeze out of them? It was a shrewd business model, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the pilgrims, one that made a lot of people in and around the temple very rich. Alongside this greed rose up yet another system of exploitation, money changing. Because only temple coins could be used to pay the temple tax and purchase the animals, bankers charged exorbitant rates to people in need of the correct currency. Both of these commercial practices created unnecessary hurdles for every pilgrim, but they were particularly unjust for the poor, which matters because most faithful people going on a pilgrimage required by their faith, like Muslims today and Jews in the past, were poor because most people on this earth are and always have been poor. So Jesus sees these vulnerable people being overcharged for their turtle doves, sees exhausted pilgrims who don't understand the exchange rates being taken advantage of. And it makes him mad. It makes him really mad, actually. It's helpful to keep in mind the story of Jesus' first visit to this temple when his family presented him there 40 days after his birth. His parents, Mary and Joseph, sacrificed 2 small birds on that occasion, a detail the Gospels tell us because it communicates that his parents could not afford the appointed sacrifice. Jesus himself had been raised poor. He likely identifies with these exhausted, hopeful, faithful people who are being taken advantage of. And in his anger, he flips out, taking the tables in his strong, calloused hands and flipping over as many as he can. He grabs the satchels of money from the money changers and dumps them out. He screams, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." I have often heard it said that when we have more than we need, we have 2 options: to build a longer table or to build a higher wall. Those in and around the temple were always going to have enough. There was enough wealth, enough trade, enough commerce to support them. They could have decided to build a longer table. Instead, They built walls, walls that made it difficult for vulnerable people to enter, walls that dehumanized their already marginalized and degraded fellow human beings, which makes Jesus mad, righteously indignant. He feels and expresses this anger, but he doesn't get stuck in it. Jesus' anger becomes a motivating force, a starting place for his earthly ministry. He is so outraged that he is moved to take action. He flipped the tables and then he went out and tried to flip the script. And for 3 years, he taught and healed, loved, and liberated because things needed to change, because what was happening in the temple wasn't okay. And in the face of injustice, he, like every one of us, was called to do his part. This story confronts us with the challenge of Jesus' anger, which in turn confronts us with the challenge of our own. Anger is a powerful emotion, energizing, fiery, quick to rise, difficult to contain, prone to explode. We are generally conflicted and confused when it comes to anger. Certain expressions of it are celebrated. The angry coach, the angry politician, both men, of course, because when women express anger, no matter how justified, it is usually pathologized in our culture, an overreaction, hysterical. On the other hand, anger really can get out of control, can even become dangerous. Probably every person in this room has said something they regretted in anger. It's understandable that we're cautious with anger, but it, like every other emotion, carries valuable information. Anger is a normal, healthy response to injustice. It's a normal, healthy response to cruelty, violence, exploitation, lies, manipulation, apathy, greed. Anger says, even screams, this is not okay. And used for constructive purposes rather than destructive ones, anger is incredibly important. Anger can help us see reality more clearly, help us discern what we are called to do and who we are called to be. It's only after the cleansing of the temple in John's gospel that Jesus sets out to begin his public ministry. This is a conversion story. Jesus' anger was a clarifying fire. It moved him. It motivated him. It gave him energy to sustain the long journey ahead. But we, like Jesus, need to be willing to draw close enough to human suffering, to be moved by it, to let ourselves be outraged, rather than burying our heads in the sand or running away. Jesus turned the tables because he saw firsthand those pilgrims being exploited, and in them, he saw himself and his God. We too are angry when we see our child or grandchild being bullied. We too are angry when our parent or an elder in our community is subject to a scam. We too are angry when our friends are derided and diminished by racism, sexism, homophobia. But are we angry when we see people we don't know personally drowning in medical debt? When we see immigrants caught in razor wire at our southern border? When we see people living on the streets of San Jose and San Francisco? Angry not at them, but at the complex circumstances that could lead to such brutality? I read recently about a faithful woman named Ranna. She lived a comfortable middle-class life in Los Angeles, was active in her synagogue. Her adult son had died of cancer a few years earlier, and she carried in her huge heart a tremendous grief. One day, while walking around downtown, she saw a young man begging for food and money, sitting with his back against a building, his sleeping bag beside him. For some reason, she couldn't tell you why, she stopped. She sat down beside him, she introduced herself, and she listened. Soon she invited him for breakfast, and by the time they had finished their meal, she invited him to move into her guest room immediately. Her friends and her rabbi were worried, understandably, for her safety. Who was this guy? Could he be trusted? Would he try to take advantage of her? But Hannah was undeterred. Having lost her own son, she looked at this young man, and she knew that he was someone's son, which meant he was deserving of every grace and dignity that she had wished for her own child. He lived with her for a year, was able to get a job, and then get back on his feet. He moved out, and they've continued to have a close relationship for the last several years. Now, not everyone is called to this kind of radical hospitality, but I think Hannah's example is instructive. Asked years later what motivated her to open her home to this stranger, she explained that she knew there was risk in doing this, but she also knew there was a risk to him in having no home at all, and that mattered just as much. Why would the potential risk to me matter more than the definite risk to him? She asked. Every single system had let this young man down until then. His family, his community, his government, and it wasn't fair. It wasn't okay. She had to do something, and she felt this was what she could do. Her anger emerged from her empathy, from identifying with the vulnerability and humanity of this other person. All genuine spiritual practice is aimed at nurturing this clarity around our deep interconnection with each other and our equality before God. Take giving. Every religion commends generosity because the practice of sharing whatever has been entrusted to us reminds us of our obligation to care for each other, reminds us that even if the systems of the world are mostly working for us, they are not working for most people, and we are called to be a part of changing that. Take pilgrimage. When my husband's mother completed the Hajj, she came home and told him about the incredible diversity of people she met in Mecca. Having never seen anyone who wasn't Pakistani, having never left Pakistan before, she was suddenly immersed in this wildly diverse group, all there for a single purpose. She could see herself in a Black African man and a white woman, a French-speaking teen, and a blind elder, and that changed her. Take service. When we draw near to the needs of others, we're confronted not only with the injustice of the world, but the dignity of every human being. From a distance, we can dehumanize, degrade, dismiss, deny, but up close, we recognize the image of the divine that shines through even our most troubled brothers and sisters. Take prayer. When we humble ourselves before God, confessing the ways we fall short, asking for help and guidance, we are reminded of our smallness and also of our power. We're reminded that we are all children of God. At the end of this service, I'll begin the final blessing with a reminder. Life is short, and we do not have too much time for gladdening the hearts of those who walk the way with us. Life is short. So, with what time we have left in this earthly pilgrimage of ours, may we be blessed with the anger of Jesus in the face of suffering. May we be blessed with the clarity of Jesus in our responses. And may we join with him in the hard and holy work of building a longer table rather than a higher wall. Amen.